Have you ever noticed how the people who hurt us the most never truly understand the power of our silence? How leaving quietly, without a fight or a scene, can unravel someone more than anger or confrontation ever could? Today, we're diving into a truth that few dare to speak out loud. Why an empath's silent departure becomes the narcissist's worst punishment. And this isn't just speculation, Carl. Jung himself gave us the framework to understand the psychic architecture of such moments. Empaths feel, deeply, every nuance. Every subtle shift in tone or energy hits them like a wave. They absorb emotions like sponges, intuitively sensing when someone is manipulating, lying, or draining them. Narcissists, on the other hand, feed on energy, control, and attention. They thrive on chaos, drama, and emotional reactions. So, when an empath quietly steps away, it's like cutting off their oxygen. They can no longer manipulate, provoke, or dominate, and this absence is their punishment. But let's step back for a moment. Imagine a relationship where one person gives endlessly, sacrificing time, peace, and even their own voice to maintain harmony. The other person, oblivious to the depths of the sacrifice, consumes, takes, and demands. What happens when the giver finally decides, not in anger, not in confrontation, but in quiet, resolute withdrawal? Enough? Here's the part nobody talks about. The narcissist doesn't see it coming. They're conditioned to expect reaction. They expect fights, tears, arguments, pleas, and justifications. Silence, in this context, is a mirror showing them what they truly are, powerless without their manipulation. The empath's departure is a subtle earthquake, invisible in motion, yet seismic in impact. Carl Jung called this the shadow encounter. The shadow, in Jungian psychology, represents the parts of ourselves we repress, deny, or refuse to confront. Narcissists by nature are often imprisoned in their own shadow. They cannot face their insecurities, fears, and the emptiness behind their mask. The empath, in withdrawing quietly, forces a confrontation with this shadow, not by attacking it, but by simply leaving. No drama, no chaos, just absence. And absence, in this sense, becomes a mirror, reflecting the emptiness the narcissist has spent their life avoiding. Consider this scenario. A young woman, let's call her Mara, in a relationship with someone she once loved deeply. Over time, she notices the subtle ways her partner undermines her self-worth, dismissive comments, gaslighting, silent treatment, and the constant demand for validation. Mara tries, initially, to reason, to fight, to appeal to the empathy she senses within him. Nothing changes. And then one evening, she simply stops. She doesn't shout, she doesn't cry, she doesn't retaliate. She disappears from the cycles that fueled his ego. Wait until you hear this. He spirals, but not in the way you might expect. There's no public scene. No friends notice. No dramatic confrontation. Instead, he's left with his own thoughts, his own inadequacies, his own craving for control, and none of the tools to soothe it. Mara's silence becomes louder than any argument could have been. Every memory of her care, every bit of her attention he once held so cheaply, becomes a ghost he cannot touch. This is the psychic punishment that Jung would describe as the collision with the unacknowledged self. But why does silence hurt so much? Why is it more devastating than anger or confrontation? Neuroscience gives us a clue. Our brains are wired to respond to social feedback. When someone we rely on for validation suddenly withdraws without explanation, the brain interprets it as a threat to survival. For the narcissist, whose emotional survival is tied to control and attention, this absence is a deep, primal alarm. There's no narrative they can control. There's no story they can rewrite. The silence speaks louder than any argument could. Let's reframe this. The empath isn't passive. Silence is a strategy of strength. It's intentional, precise, and aware. By withdrawing quietly, the empath preserves their energy, restores boundaries, and avoids feeding the very chaos the narcissist craves. In a sense, the empath becomes the hero of their own story, not by fighting the dragon, but by walking away and letting the dragon face itself. Here's a metaphor. Imagine a fire that consumes everything around it. No matter how much water you throw, it rages on. Now imagine removing the fuel instead of dousing the flames. The fire sputters, smolders, and eventually collapses in on itself. The empath's departure is like removing the fuel, not with confrontation, not with drama, but simply by stepping out of reach. But there's a deeper psychological layer here. Empaths don't leave lightly. Every withdrawal carries guilt, sadness, and a recognition of the human complexity in those they leave behind. Yet this very act of leaving with dignity, quiet, and self-respect forces the narcissist to confront something they cannot handle. The reality that they cannot control everything. They cannot manipulate everyone. Their power, once so sure, suddenly falters. Here's the next truth that will shock you. This silent departure doesn't just punish. It frees. It frees the empath from cycles of pain, resentment, and energy depletion. It frees them to reclaim identity, clarity, and joy. And for the narcissist, it triggers the shadow confrontation warned about the parts of themselves they've hidden from the world and, crucially, from themselves. Think about this. Every argument, every fight, every tearful plea that once failed to shift the narcissist is now obsolete. Nothing matters except absence. And the empath's quiet exit becomes a profound act of self-preservation that paradoxically delivers the ultimate psychological blow, not through words, but through energy. But here's what most people miss. The narcissist doesn't need to know why the empath left. The absence itself, the void created by one who truly cared yet knew when to walk away, becomes an unanswerable question. It stirs insecurity, regret, and a craving that cannot be fulfilled. This is the invisible punishment, and it is devastating precisely because it is unspoken, undeniable, and uncounterable. As we move forward, you'll see why this principle applies far beyond romantic relationships. It shapes family dynamics, friendships, workplaces, and even the way society interacts with sensitive, empathic individuals. The silent departure is a universal strategy of self-preservation and quiet empowerment. And understanding it in Jungian terms is to see the dance between light, shadow, energy, and control, between those who feel deeply and those who cannot bear depth without domination. Before we move to the next part, remember this: the empath's power is hidden, subtle, and often underestimated. They may seem fragile, emotional, or even too sensitive, yet the very qualities that make them vulnerable to exploitation also grant them the ability to impose profound change without confrontation. Silence becomes their sword. Withdrawal becomes their shield. And in that quiet, unseen act, the narcissist faces a punishment more precise and more revealing than any argument could deliver. Imagine this. You've spent years pouring yourself into someone who never truly saw you. You've bent, stretched, and reshaped yourself to fit their world, always hoping that one day the love, recognition, or respect you crave would finally come. For an empath, this isn't just a pattern, it's almost instinctual. Feeling others' pain and emotions becomes part of your identity. But here's the brutal truth most people overlook. The moment you finally decide to leave quietly, the narcissist doesn't just feel abandoned, they spiral into a psychological storm they aren't equipped to survive. Let's go deeper. The first stage of the narcissist's reaction is confusion. They search for reasons, replay conversations, dissect behaviors. They may ask themselves, did I miss something? Did I do enough? But here's the part nobody talks about. Narcissists rarely introspect in any meaningful way. Their confusion isn't about growth or learning, it's about control. They're trying to regain the energy and dominance they just lost. And when the empath's departure offers no confrontation, no explanation, no opportunity for manipulation, it feels like reality itself has betrayed them. Consider a story from real life. A man we'll call Victor had a coworker, Elaine, who was known for her empathy and quiet wisdom. Victor, a textbook narcissist, thrived on attention, praise, and subtle control. He criticized, belittled, and manipulated, yet Elaine endured silently, hoping rational appeals would eventually work. One day, without fanfare, she submitted her resignation. She didn't leave a note explaining her decision. She didn't lash out. She simply stopped participating in the web of energy he had spun around her. The result? Victor was left destabilized. No outburst, no confrontation, only emptiness. He called her repeatedly, emailed her, even tried to draw others into questioning her loyalty or intentions. And yet, Elaine remained unreachable. Her absence an invisible echo that haunted him more than any argument could have. Wait until you hear this. The narcissist doesn't recover quickly from such a loss. Their mind enters a loop of obsession and projection. Every interaction they once had with the empath is scrutinized. Every compliment, every gesture of kindness they previously dismissed, now feels like a missed opportunity, a reminder of their inadequacy. This is the silent psychological warfare that the empath's exit initiates, not with malice, but with clarity and self-preservation. Let's examine why this works so powerfully. Narcissists have a fragile self-concept that depends on external validation. They need a constant stream of emotional responses to maintain the illusion of control. When an empath withdraws, the narcissist loses that validation, and suddenly, they are forced to confront the void within themselves, a void they've spent years denying. This confrontation triggers feelings they cannot tolerate: emptiness, vulnerability, and fear of insignificance. Jung called this collision with the shadow, and it's as uncomfortable as it sounds, but here's a truth that will shock you. The empath doesn't need to say a word for this to happen. Every text ignored, every unanswered call, every absence from familiar patterns amplifies the narcissist's inner chaos. Silence becomes a mirror showing the narcissist the reflection they refuse to face. And because they cannot process this absence through empathy, reasoning, or humility, it festers into obsession. Think of it like this. A narcissist's energy is like a parasite. It feeds on attention, admiration, and emotional reactions. Remove the host and the parasite becomes desperate, erratic, and exposed. The empath, in contrast, is like a gardener who quietly pulls the weeds. No struggle, no conflict, just removal of the toxic presence. The growth that follows is unseen by the narcissist but undeniable to the empath. But here's the subtle twist. Leaving silently isn't easy. Empaths wrestle with guilt, doubt, and a deep sense of responsibility. They wonder, am I abandoning them? Am I overreacting? Could I have tried harder? This internal struggle is precisely what gives the silent departure its power. The empath's choice is not born of cruelty, but of conscious, boundary setting and energy preservation. By choosing themselves, they awaken a clarity the narcissist cannot replicate. Here's another scenario. Imagine a mother and daughter, Clara and Lila. Lila has always been the family empath, sensitive, aware, and absorbing everyone's pain. Clara, her mother, exhibits narcissistic traits, controlling, critical, and dismissive. For years, Lila adjusted her behavior to avoid conflict, often suppressing her own needs. Eventually, she moves out quietly with no explanation, choosing emotional distance over endless compromise. The result? Clara is bewildered, enraged, and obsessed with trying to reclaim control, yet she finds herself powerless. Lila's absence becomes a psychic wound that cannot be soothed by manipulation or guilt, but the story doesn't end there. This silent departure also teaches an unspoken lesson: that power lies not in control, domination, or drama, but in presence, clarity, and self-respect. The empath models a form of strength that is often invisible yet profoundly transformative. And for the narcissist, it's a lesson they are ill-equipped to understand. Losing someone doesn't have to involve chaos, confrontation, or loud declarations. Sometimes, leaving quietly is more devastating than any battle. Wait until you hear this. The empath's departure can also trigger deep self-reflection, not in the narcissist, but in those around them. Friends, colleagues, or family members who witness the absence may start questioning their own behavior, realizing the empath's value and seeing the patterns of toxicity that were previously normalized. The ripple effect is subtle, quiet, but widespread, and here's where Jung's ideas become even more relevant. In his exploration of the shadow and individuation, Jung suggested that the path to psychological wholeness often requires separation from toxic influences. For empaths, this quiet departure isn't just a reaction to narcissistic behavior, it's a step toward individuation, toward reclaiming one's identity and toward embracing the psychic energy that had long been misappropriated. The act of leaving silently is both defense and evolution, but here's a revelation few articulate. The silent departure also exposes the narcissist's lack of resilience. It shows that their apparent strength, dominance, control, charisma is fragile. They can handle confrontation, conflict, or superficial opposition, but they cannot handle absence. This realization is subtle, uncomfortable, and irreversible. The empath doesn't need to explain, argue, or justify. The silence itself is sufficient, finally. Consider this. Every empath who leaves quietly is participating in a hidden psychological principle, a dance between energy, awareness, and boundaries. They are not escaping. They are reclaiming. They are not punishing. They are preserving. And they are not powerless. Their absence becomes a force of undeniable psychological consequence. This next truth will shock you. Even years later, the impact of a silent departure lingers. The narcissist may rebuild, refocus, or find new sources of control, but the memory of the absence, the encounter with their own shadow, remains. And in that memory lies the ultimate quiet punishment delivered not by anger, confrontation, or accusation, but by presence withheld and boundaries asserted. By now, you may be wondering, how does an empath even begin to step away quietly without feeling like a traitor to their own heart? How does one disentangle themselves from a narcissist's web without guilt, shame, or self-doubt consuming every thought? This next truth will shock you. Leaving silently is not just an act of courage, it's a form of healing. Empaths carry the weight of others, emotions like invisible chains. Every manipulation, every subtle insult, every gaslight moment creates a deposit in the emotional bank account they can't withdraw from easily. Over time, the account overflows. Anger, sadness, exhaustion, confusion, all compound until the empath realizes that continuing to engage is no longer sustainable. Yet the decision to leave is rarely impulsive. It's a quiet, deliberate recognition of what Carl Jung might call the call of the self, an imperative to honor one's own psyche, energy, and boundaries. But here's the part nobody talks about, the internal struggle of leaving. Empaths feel a duality, a pull toward loyalty, compassion, and love, and a simultaneous push toward self-preservation. Imagine being torn between two powerful forces inside your chest. One says, "I can fix this. I can heal them. I can stay," the other whispers, "Your energy is precious. Step back. Protect your life." The silent departure is born from the latter. And this is where the true strength of the empath emerges. Let me illustrate with a story. Consider a man named Adrian, who had always been sensitive to the moods of his colleagues and friends. He naturally absorbed their stress and emotional turbulence, often sacrificing his own well-being to keep peace. In one particular friendship, he was drawn to someone who, on the surface, seemed charming and thoughtful but consistently demanded emotional labor from him. Over time, Adrian's sense of self began to erode. Every interaction felt like giving water to a bucket with no bottom. Finally, one day he stopped answering calls and declined invitations. Not angrily, not dramatically, but calmly, intentionally, and quietly. The results were profound. His friend initially assumed Adrian was angry and tried to provoke confrontation. When no reaction came, panic set in. The absence became louder than any words could have been. Adrian felt a rush of liberation, clarity, and restored energy. He realized that self-preservation was not betrayal. It was survival. This is the paradox. The act of leaving silently is simultaneously the hardest and the most empowering thing an empath can do. Wait until you hear this. The empath's healing does not require revenge or confrontation. The narcissist, left to face the void, begins their internal unraveling without the empath needing to intervene. Every unanswered message, every absence, and every boundary set without explanation is like a slow-release psychological earthquake. The empath heals while the narcissist contemplates what they cannot control. But how does one do this practically? How does an empath create this kind of quiet exit without being drawn back into the familiar patterns of guilt or manipulation? The first step is awareness. recognizing the narcissistic patterns, the gaslighting, the emotional vampirism. The manipulation allows the empath to see clearly that leaving is not an act of cruelty, but of necessity. Awareness is the compass. It points toward freedom. The second step is preparation. This does not mean confrontation, nor does it mean announcing a departure. It means mentally and emotionally rehearsing the decision to protect oneself. It involves strengthening boundaries, limiting exposure, and crucially, detaching from the need to justify, explain, or win approval. The empath practices silence not as punishment, but as armor, invisible, impenetrable, and profoundly effective. Consider a metaphor. Imagine a violinist who has been playing for someone else for years, pouring every ounce of skill and soul into performances that are never acknowledged. One day, the violinist simply stops playing for them and begins performing for themselves. The music does not stop. It only changes direction. Silence, in this context, is not absence from life, it is presence in oneself. Here's the part that will surprise many. Narcissists are uniquely sensitive to these shifts in energy because their world is built on reaction. They cannot tolerate indifference, lack of engagement, or autonomy outside their influence. The empath's quiet withdrawal is like removing the strings from the violin the narcissist thought they could play endlessly. Suddenly, the instrument of control is useless. And here's the subtle genius of it. The empath never strikes. They simply step back, but there's another layer few notice. Silence is also a mirror of reflection for the empath. In stepping away, they confront their own patterns, their own shadows, and their own wounds. Carl Jung emphasized that individuation, the process of becoming whole, often requires separation from toxic influences. The act of leaving quietly is not merely defensive. It is a path toward psychological integration. Empaths learn not only how to protect themselves, but also how to reclaim the parts of themselves they have given away over years of emotional labor. Let me give you another example. A woman named Leora had spent her early adulthood in a relationship with someone controlling, manipulative, and emotionally distant. Leora was profoundly empathic and sensitive to his moods, often restructuring her life around his needs. One morning, she simply left. No confrontation, no explanation, no anger, just absence. Over time, her former partner descended into obsession, replaying memories, questioning his control, and ultimately confronting his emptiness. Meanwhile, Leora began to thrive, reconnecting with friends, pursuing passions, and rebuilding her sense of identity. The silent departure was her liberation, and unknowingly, his punishment. Wait until you hear this. The empath's silence is a form of energy medicine. It recalibrates the dynamics of the relationship without adding chaos, confrontation, or blame. The narcissist, left in the vacuum, experiences the destabilization they are unprepared for. And the empath, by stepping into their own power, models a form of resilience that is often underestimated. But here's the paradox. Empathy does not vanish in this process. The quiet departure is not about revenge. It is not about proving who is right or wrong. True empathic withdrawal is rooted in compassion for oneself, recognizing that caring for someone else's emotional needs should never come at the cost of one's own mental health. The silence is a gift to both parties. The empath gains freedom, and the narcissist gains the unavoidable confrontation with their shadow, whether they like it or not. Finally, remember this: the power of leaving silently is cumulative. Each act of boundary setting, each step back from manipulation, each quiet withdrawal reinforces the empath's autonomy and the narcissist's inability to control them. Over time, this pattern transforms the empath's life, and, in some cases, the narcissist's psyche in ways that loud arguments, confrontations, or attempts at persuasion could never achieve. As we move into the next section, we'll explore how silence impacts not only the narcissist, but the broader social ecosystem. Friends, family, colleagues, all are affected by the empath's departure. The ripple effect of energy withdrawal is subtle, invisible, and yet undeniable. And we'll uncover the hidden ways this quiet act of power reshapes relationships far beyond the immediate dyad of empath and narcissist. By now, you may be realizing that the empath's quiet departure isn't just a Personal act, it's a seismic event in the relational world around them. The ripple effects extend far beyond the narcissist who loses control. Friends, family, colleagues, and even casual acquaintances are subtly influenced by the shift in energy, often without fully realizing why. Wait until you hear this. One person choosing self-preservation can redefine entire social dynamics. Imagine a workplace scenario. An empath, let's call her Nadia, consistently absorbs the moods and tensions of a toxic manager, often mediating conflicts, smoothing over frustrations, and shouldering invisible emotional labor. One day, Nadia resigns quietly. No dramatic exit, no confrontations, no heated emails, just absence. Her coworkers, once complicit in tolerating the manager's behavior, begin to notice the void. Tasks pile up differently, conversations change tone, and the manager's manipulative patterns start to unravel. The narcissist, accustomed to having an empathetic buffer, suddenly faces the reality of their behavior without mediation. And here's the subtle truth: the ripple effect reaches everyone, forcing a recalibration of social energy that could have taken years to manifest otherwise. But why does this ripple effect hit so hard? It's because empaths serve as the emotional regulators of their environments. Their presence often masks or mitigates dysfunction, providing subtle guidance without overt authority. When they withdraw, the dysfunction is exposed in raw form. Narcissists, stripped of their primary source of validation and containment, are forced into discomfort and often projection. Jung called projection the mechanism by which we see in others the traits we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves. The empath's absence becomes a mirror not only for the narcissist, but also for the people around them, revealing what has been hidden or normalized. Consider the example of Marcus, a young man whose family dynamics were dominated by his older brother, a narcissist who thrived on control and attention. Marcus, naturally empathic, spent decades mediating disputes, soothing his brother's insecurities and shielding the family from emotional chaos. Finally, Marcus moved across the country, quietly disengaging from family conflicts. Suddenly, the brother's behaviors, once tolerated or rationalized, were laid bare. Other family members, who had long overlooked manipulation, began to see the patterns clearly. The empath's departure triggered a chain reaction of awareness, introspection, and subtle recalibration. Here's the part nobody talks about. The empath's absence forces others to confront the reality that they, too, have been complicit in maintaining the status quo. People realize that enabling the narcissist's behavior is no longer possible without the empath's stabilizing presence. The empath's silence, in essence, becomes a catalyst for transformation, even in people who are not the primary target of narcissistic behavior. But here's the next shocking truth. Narcissists often respond to this ripple effect with a combination of projection, manipulation, and frantic attempts to regain control. They may attempt to smear the empath's reputation, cast doubt on their motives, or enlist others to their side. This is not a reflection of the empath's powerlessness. It is a desperate attempt by the narcissist to reassert control over the social environment they believe they dominated. And here's the ironic twist. The more they attempt to control others' perceptions, the more their own shadow is revealed. Let's explore another metaphor. Picture a calm lake. The empath's presence is like a stone submerged beneath the surface, gently balancing currents and stabilizing the ecosystem. When the empath withdraws, the stone is removed. The water ripples, currents shift, and chaos temporarily emerges on the surface. Those watching may feel disoriented, even frightened, but ultimately, the lake begins to find a new equilibrium. The empath's quiet departure is the catalyst for the natural recalibration of energy. Wait until you hear this. The ripple effect is not just social, but also psychological. Narcissists, deprived of their energy source, experience cognitive dissonance. They may insist they were never dependent on the empath, yet internally they feel destabilized. Their inability to tolerate absence forces them to confront the limitations of their control, the fragility of their ego, and the emptiness beneath their outward confidence. Silence, in this sense, is more punishing than confrontation because it provides no avenue for manipulation or deflection. And here's a deeper layer few understand: empaths In leaving quietly, are modeling emotional intelligence at a level most people do not recognize. By prioritizing their own boundaries, they demonstrate a form of leadership through energy rather than authority. Their absence teaches others, whether intentionally or not, about self-respect, personal limits, and the power of non-reaction. Those around the narcissist, witnessing this, may begin to question their own behaviors and alliances, creating a subtle but profound shift in social dynamics. Consider a story from social dynamics research. In group environments, a single emotionally intelligent individual can stabilize or destabilize a collective. When that person withdraws, the equilibrium shifts. People are forced to confront unacknowledged tensions, communication patterns, and relational imbalances. The empath's silent departure serves as an invisible corrective force, a nudge toward reality that is experienced by everyone connected to the narcissist. But here's the truth that hits hardest. The narcissist cannot process this absence through reasoning or empathy. Their brain is wired to seek control, validation, and predictable responses. The empath's withdrawal creates uncertainty, and uncertainty is intolerable for the narcissist. They may attempt to fill the void with drama, blame, or even false charm, but none of these strategies truly address the psychological imbalance. The empath's silence cannot be co-opted, argued with, or countered. It simply exists as a testament to personal boundaries and self-preservation. And here's the part most people miss. The ripple effect also empowers the empath. By stepping away, they not only protect their energy, but also reclaim influence over their own life. They are no longer caught in the orbit of the narcissist's needs or projections. Every silent boundary set reinforces their autonomy, self-respect, and ability to navigate the world without being drained by toxic dynamics. In a sense, leaving quietly is both a sword and a shield. It protects and transforms simultaneously. Wait until you hear this. Even when the empath is physically removed from the narcissist's sphere, the impact endures. Patterns of obsession, projection, and destabilization can last for months or years. The narcissist may attempt to reassert control or reconnect, but the empath's absence, coupled with the lessons of boundaries and self-respect, creates a psychological marker that is difficult to erase. Jung might call this the lasting imprint of the individuation process, a permanent shift in consciousness that begins with one deliberate choice. Finally, understand this. The empath's quiet departure is not a failure, a loss, or an act of cruelty. It is a strategic, compassionate, and deeply transformative act. It teaches the narcissist about their own limitations, forces the social environment to recalibrate, and empowers the empath to reclaim energy and identity. In a world that often celebrates confrontation and drama, the empath demonstrates a subtler, more profound power, the ability to influence, protect, and transform simply through conscious absence. Now, let's explore something most people don't realize. The silent departure of an empath doesn't just create short-term disruption, it leaves long-term echoes in the narcissist's psyche. Wait until you hear this. Even years after the empath walks away, the narcissist may remain haunted by their absence, replaying memories, and projecting fantasies of control that can never be fulfilled. This is where Carl Jung's insights into the shadow become critical. The shadow, remember, represents the aspects of ourselves we deny or repress. Narcissists live heavily in the shadow, avoiding vulnerability, denying weakness, and masking emptiness with charm, aggression, or manipulation. When an empath leaves quietly, the narcissist is forced to confront these denied aspects. They feel the absence of control, the lack of validation, and the void of attention they once took for granted. Because they cannot face this directly, their mind spins into obsession and projection, often without the narcissist even recognizing why they feel unsettled. Consider the story of Julia, who left a toxic romantic relationship with no confrontation. Her partner, a classic narcissist, expected drama, tears, or arguments. Instead, he found silence. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. He replayed every interaction, analyzing her words, gestures, and even pauses. He sought explanations from friends and family, attempting to reconstruct control that had vanished. But the absence, the very thing he could not control, became an invisible punishment far greater than any fight could have inflicted. Here's the next truth few discuss. The narcissist's obsession is not about the empath's actions, but about what the empath's departure exposes. The absence highlights the emptiness of the narcissist's life, the fragility of their ego, and the limits of their influence. Jung would say that this is a forced encounter with the shadow, an experience so unsettling that it can provoke intense emotional and psychological discomfort. Yet the empath never speaks, never returns, and never validates the chaos, making the punishment silent, precise, and unforgettable. But there's a deeper layer here. Narcissists may attempt to fill the void with substitutes, new partners, attention from colleagues, or social validation. Yet these substitutes never satisfy the same need that the empath once fulfilled, because the empath's energy was unique, authentic, intuitive, and deeply engaged. The narcissist may chase these illusions for years, never realizing that their desperation stems from a confrontation with the absence of genuine connection. A connection they had taken for granted. Let's break this down further. Psychologists describe narcissistic obsession in stages. First comes denial, refusing to acknowledge the empath's departure as permanent. Then comes projection, attributing their feelings of inadequacy, guilt, or emptiness onto others, often blaming friends, colleagues, or even the empath indirectly. Finally comes obsession, an endless loop of mental replay, attempts at reasserting control, and fantasies of reclaiming what has already slipped away. And here's the shocking truth. This cycle often continues long after the empath has moved on, healed, and reclaimed their energy. Consider another story. Marcus, an empath who left a manipulative friendship quietly, found peace in his absence. His former friend, a narcissist, began a subtle campaign of projection, spreading rumors, questioning Marcus's motives, and attempting to control the narrative among mutual acquaintances. Marcus never responded. He never argued. He simply continued his life. Over time, the narcissist's behavior revealed more about their own insecurities than about Marcus. While Marcus grew stronger, wiser, and more self-aware. This illustrates the paradox. The empath's silence inflicts the ultimate psychological punishment while simultaneously fostering their own growth. Wait until you hear this. The long-term consequences for the narcissist go beyond personal obsession. They often experience what therapists call energy depletion, a state where their attempts to manipulate and control yield diminishing returns. The empath's absence leaves a vacuum in their emotional ecosystem, creating discomfort that cannot be remedied by superficial attention or new sources of validation. In essence, the narcissist learns, painfully and involuntarily, that some energy cannot be stolen, only freely given and once withheld. It cannot be reclaimed, but here's another twist. The empath's departure can awaken latent self-reflection in the narcissist, though rarely in a way they consciously admit. By being confronted with absence, they may temporarily recognize the consequences of their behavior, the patterns of control they relied on, and the relational wounds they inflicted. This is rarely permanent because narcissists are resistant to sustained introspection, but it's a fleeting glimpse into the shadow they usually evade. The empath, by leaving quietly, forces a confrontation with a truth the narcissist cannot fabricate or deny, and here's the subtle power of it. The empath continues to influence the narcissist's life without any direct action. The absence itself becomes a guiding force. Every time the narcissist recalls the empath, they encounter the unhealed parts of themselves. Every failed attempt at regaining control reinforces the lesson. Presence, authenticity, and boundaries cannot be coerced. The empath's departure is, in essence, a long-term psychological recalibration, silent, invisible, but incredibly potent. Let's return to Jung. He suggested that individuation, the process of becoming whole, often requires separating from toxic influences. For empaths, leaving the narcissist is a step toward their own individuation. By withdrawing, they reclaim fragmented energy, heal from emotional exploitation, and begin constructing a self that is independent of external manipulation. The empath grows stronger precisely because they refuse to feed the narcissist's shadow, preserving their own vitality instead. But here's the part most people overlook. The narcissist is often unaware of their own transformation or deterioration. They may believe the world continues unchanged, yet internally, they are forced to confront their limitations, insecurities, and emptiness. The empath's silent departure is like a mirror held up without comment, revealing a reflection the narcissist cannot hide from, yet cannot fully process. And this is why silence is more punishing than confrontation, more effective than anger, and more lasting than drama. Wait until you hear this. Even in public or shared social spaces, the absence of an empath shifts energy dynamics in ways that narcissists cannot manage. Their attempts to dominate conversations, relationships, or influence others become less effective because the empath has removed the emotional fuel. This can lead to further frustration, projection, and sometimes even social isolation for the narcissist, a silent echo of the punishment set in motion by the empath's choice. Finally, remember this: the long-term impact of a quiet departure is profound. It is not about revenge. It is not about cruelty. It is about reclaiming power, setting boundaries, and protecting one's energy. For the narcissist, it is a harsh, unavoidable lesson in limits and absence. For the empath, it is liberation, healing, and growth. The silent departure is the ultimate demonstration of self-respect and psychological insight, a masterclass in power without aggression, influence without confrontation, and freedom without drama. Now let's shift the focus. Up until this point, we've explored the narcissist's unraveling, the ripple effects, and the long-term psychological consequences of an empath's silent departure. But what about the empath themselves? What happens in the quiet aftermath when the echoes of absence fade and the space for self begins to emerge? This next truth will shock you. Leaving quietly is not just a defensive act, it's the beginning of profound transformation. Imagine stepping out of a shadowed room after years of absorbing someone else's energy. At first, the light is blinding. The empath feels unsteady, unsure how to navigate life without constantly moderating someone else's emotions. There may be guilt, doubt, or lingering attachment. But here's the critical point. These feelings are part of the healing process, not obstacles. Carl Jung emphasized that the path to individuation, the journey toward a whole, integrated self, requires confronting and integrating these internal tensions. Leaving is just the first step. Let's explore this through a story. Sienna had spent a decade in a relationship with a narcissist. Every choice she made, every emotional investment, was filtered through his needs, insecurities, and manipulation. When she finally left quietly, she felt disoriented. Her first weeks were quiet, almost eerily so, filled with the absence of constant emotional turbulence. Yet, as time passed, she began to notice subtle shifts, clarity in her thoughts, freedom in her decisions, and a gradual return of her natural energy. The quiet departure, which had shaken the narcissist profoundly, allowed Sienna to step into her own power in ways she had never imagined. Wait until you hear this. The empath's energy begins to realign. Years of emotional absorption and manipulation can leave psychic debris, patterns of anxiety, self-doubt, and hypervigilance. When the empath withdraws from the source of toxicity, they create space for restoration. It's not instantaneous. Healing requires conscious attention, meditation, reflection, setting boundaries, and importantly, reclaiming the energy that was once invested in maintaining someone else's control. Here's a metaphor. Imagine a garden that has been overshadowed by an invasive tree. The empath's life, like the soil, has been dominated by someone else's roots, draining nutrients and taking up space. When the invasive presence is removed, the soil can breathe. Seeds that were long dormant begin to sprout. Flowers that never had room to bloom finally rise toward the light. The quiet departure is the act that clears the space, and the empath's healing is the natural growth that follows. But here's the subtle truth. Empowerment doesn't come merely from absence. It comes from conscious reclaiming of energy and boundaries. Empaths learn to notice when they are overextending, when they are absorbing negativity, and when they are giving beyond what is healthy. They begin to understand that self-care is not selfish. In fact, it is the foundation of authentic empathy. True healing is rooted in the awareness that they can care deeply without sacrificing, their own vitality. Consider another story. Elias had been an empath in a corporate environment dominated by a manipulative superior. For years, he mediated conflicts, absorbed stress, and smoothed over crises that were not his responsibility. When he left quietly, he initially felt guilt and self-doubt. But as weeks passed, he noticed a transformation. He was no longer tethered to someone else's chaos. His mind became clearer, his creativity surged, and he began forming relationships that were balanced and mutually nourishing. The silent departure had triggered a domino effect. Not only had he freed himself, but he also became a magnet for healthier connections. But here's the part nobody talks about. Empaths often experience spiritual awakening during this period of quiet. Freed from toxic influence, they can access deeper layers of intuition, insight, and energy awareness. They notice patterns, synchronicities, and subtle cues that were previously masked by emotional exhaustion. This awakening is both psychological and spiritual, a reclamation of power that was never truly lost, only obscured by years of manipulation and absorption. Wait until you hear this. The empath's silent departure is an act of self-sovereignty. They are no longer defined by the narcissist's narrative, nor do they respond to external validation in the same compulsive way. Each decision, each boundary, each choice to protect their energy reinforces autonomy. Over time, this creates an internal landscape that is resilient, grounded, and self-directed. The quiet exit becomes not only a method of protection, but a blueprint for personal evolution. Here's a crucial insight. The empath's empowerment reverberates beyond the immediate narcissist relationship. Friends, family, and colleagues notice the change. There's a shift in presence, tone, and energy that others cannot ignore. The empath becomes a living example of self-respect, emotional intelligence, and conscious boundaries. And here's the irony. The narcissist, still caught in the loops of obsession and projection, may never realize the true extent of the transformation they triggered, quietly and unwillingly. Consider this. In the weeks and months following departure, empaths often report profound internal shifts. Anxiety diminishes, intuition sharpens, and relationships become more balanced. They recognize their value without needing validation, and their energy becomes a currency they control consciously. Jung would call this individuation, the integration of self, shadow, and energy into a coherent, autonomous identity. The silent departure was the catalyst, but the real transformation is ongoing, internal, and deeply empowering. But here's the part that surprises most people. Empaths sometimes find that their departure affects the narcissist in unexpected ways even years later. Memories, subconscious awareness of boundaries, and the echo of absence continue to influence dynamics subtly. The narcissist, deprived of easy access to the empath's energy, may continue cycles of obsession, projection, or failed attempts at influence. And all the while, the empath lives fully in their reclaimed space, free from the psychic drain that once defined them. Finally, understand this. The silent departure is not an ending. It's the beginning of a journey. It is the first step in reclaiming power, energy, and clarity. For the empath, it marks the start of self-sovereignty, spiritual awakening, and psychological integration. For the narcissist, it is a mirror, a punishment, and a challenge they are often ill-equipped to face. And for everyone watching, it is a lesson in the quiet power of boundaries, presence, and conscious absence.